Okay, this is a research synthesis of caregiver responsiveness, and it was done partly to identify whether or not the characteristics of a particular instructional practice that we have developed called responsive teaching, in fact, has evidence for the characteristics. And so it was a research synthesis of mother-child, father-child, and caregiver-child interactions in which the researchers coded the use of different types of caregiver responsiveness. There were 46 observational studies of almost 6,000 child-adult pairs. The outcomes included child nonverbal communication, expressive language, and receptive language. And then when you're doing these naturalistic reviews of naturalistic studies, you usually use correlation coefficients just to make them similar to the ones I just showed. I converted them to Cohen's d to illustrate the relationship. And so these are the characteristics that we coded in the different studies. Each of these are part of the particular approach to responsive teaching that we use. Other responsive teaching methods include other characteristics. We were just looking at our own. And so, for example, the second one, following the child's lead, is a contingent responsiveness. It's simply, to what extent did the adult respond to the child in response to the child producing a behavior, for example, a nonverbal gesture directed towards the adult. And so we looked at each of those characteristics. Now, unlike the adult learning review, is that people who did these studies all had their favorite characteristics, which kind of surprised me. I thought that they would have measured lots and lots of different things. For example, in a similar review of the relationship between these and other characteristics and child attachment, in those studies, the researchers tend to measure a lot of that stuff simultaneously, and then you can do the same thing in terms of asking the question, if you do 1, 2, 3, or 4 of them, does it matter more? Unfortunately, in these studies, about 85% of the studies, the researchers only looked at one of the characteristics. And so when you look at the effects, you'll notice the size of the numbers on the right-hand side are almost all about equal, indicating that any one of the characteristics was associated with differences in the child outcomes. As I said, unfortunately, we couldn't do the same type of analysis, but at least we know from those findings that the characteristics that we're trying to teach practitioners and parents to use are in fact associated with better child outcomes. Actually, the top one is really not that important. The more important thing is the caregiver interactional behavior related to child outcomes regardless of child condition. And in fact, is the effects on children with identified disabilities tended to be larger than all the other ones. And so people often ask me, is responsive teaching a good strategy to use with children with identified disabilities? And my response has always been yes, because those children can benefit just as much as anyone else. But there's a problem with this. So I know the characteristics of adult learning, I know the characteristics of responsive teaching, but knowing the characteristics is no guarantee that people will actually use them as part of their work. And so you have to start asking the question about fidelity of the use of the practice. And fidelity just refers to the extent to which the characteristics of the practices are used consistently when they're being used by a professional development specialist or an early childhood practitioner. And so you can elaborate on that model and ask the question, are the evidence-based characteristics of implementation and intervention practices used with fidelity? And then whether or not that's associated with better outcomes. And I'm not going to go into detail about this. This is really the focus of my current work, is trying to unpack the extent to which there are hypothesized relationships between fidelity of implementation, fidelity of intervention, and child outcomes. And I'll show you one other factor that turns out to be important. So I'll just illustrate this with a couple of different studies. The first one is a study that was conducted in 10 Head Start classrooms serving 3 to 5-year-old children and a mixture of children with and without disabilities. The Head Start staff, a teacher and teacher assistant, participated in weekly on-the-job training where a coach used the implementation practices, a particular version of PALS, to promote the teacher's use of different intervention practices. In this particular case, the example is responsive teaching. And then we looked at the relationship between variation in implementation fidelity and responsive teaching. Okay, so we define fidelity as the percent of 20 indicators that were rated a 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale. We actually got a fairly high level of fidelity of use of the implementation practices, about 88%. But the standard deviation shows that it ranged as low as about 75%. And there's lots of reasons for that. For example, the coach goes out, is that the teacher assistant is sick that day, the teacher has to take care of the whole class, and there isn't as much opportunity to use PALS to promote the teacher's use of the practices. So what we did, because there's variability in the PALS fidelity, is we divided them up into the lowest third, middle third, and highest third, and then simply asked the question, was there a relationship between the fidelity of PALS and the fidelity of the teacher's use of the responsive teaching? And as we would have expected, is a large percentage of use of the PALS characteristics is associated with more use of responsive teaching. The ones that are low, and I believe they're all, if I remember correctly, they're all like 82% or lower. But you can see there's massive differences, very large differences between low implementation fidelity and teacher use of the responsive teaching practices. Okay, now I'm going to add another factor into the mix here. You know, I could be a super effective coach. I can have a cape that says super effective coach on it, and I could be using the most effective professional development practices, but it's not likely to promote the use of evidence-based intervention practices if I don't believe that the practices are worth my time or effort. And so in a research review of 29 studies, including more than 4,000 early childhood practitioners, what we found was that belief appraisals related to the intent to use or actual use of different kinds of intervention practices was associated with differences in whether or not, for example, there's a whole series of inclusion studies about early childhood teachers believing that children with disabilities ought to be included in regular preschool placements. And when the teachers didn't believe that children with disabilities should be included, is that they made no effort to attempt to learn about inclusion or to get assistance with how to promote children with disabilities inclusion in the practices. Now, practitioner judgments of the importance and acceptability of intervention practices and the outcomes stand out in our own research as being important if parents or practitioners are likely to use evidence-based intervention practices. And so there's two types of judgments. There's actually a matrix, not explaining that bit. Judgments of the importance of an intervention practice and the intended benefits is one type of social validity judgment. For example, this is a practice I should be using with the children with whom I work. So for example, I would ask a parent or practitioner to indicate the extent to which responsive teaching would be kind of worth their time and effort. And then practitioner judgments of the acceptability of the practice is, for example, one of the things we know is that if a parent or practitioner perceives a practice as more trouble than it's worth, is that they're unlikely to use it. Now, I should have put this matrix in there. There's a matrix if you have importance and acceptability, and then 4 cells in the matrix. One is the practice and one is the outcomes. You have to say yes in all 4 of the cells in the matrix before you're likely to actually use a practice. And so we have all these scales we developed to be able to capture the 4 dimensions in the matrix to determine the extent to which someone has a belief that the practice is worth doing and it's likely to have outcomes that are worthwhile. And so one of the most recent studies we've done is from a study of 29 early intervention practitioners from 4 different states. And we had the practitioners were working with 80 parents of infants and toddlers with identified disabilities. And the whole focus of the project was promoting the practitioner's use of PALS with interactions with the parents to promote the parents' use of evidence-based intervention practices. And the intervention practices were interest-based everyday child learning opportunity as sources of child language learning outcomes, and that was the focus of it. And so we used fidelity scales to assess the practitioner's use of PALS. So for example, none of these practitioners worked for me. They all worked for other programs. And I would be working with a practitioner to promote their use of PALS and the practices that they were going to help the parents use. And then the practitioners would work with the parents using PALS, and then to engage the parents in use of the everyday child language learning activities. And so as part of the study, we asked parents to complete a social validity scale, and they also maintain records of how many everyday activities were used as child learning opportunities, and then the extent to which the child participation in the activities were characterized by evidence-based features. And so, for example, the parents could engage their children in everyday activities, but theoretically they could engage them in the activities in a way that didn't have the evidence-based characteristics. And so we had a way of measuring the extent to which the activities were child interest-based, is whether or not the child was engaged in the activities, whether or not the child produced different types of nonverbal and verbal communication behavior, the extent to which the child demonstrated some sense of mastery while producing the communication behavior. It was a whole set of characteristics. Okay, now this gets a little more complicated. This is the simple version. Okay, so what we have is the practitioner fidelity of using the coaching practices, the parent social validity judgments of the everyday child language learning practices, and then we have a measure of the extent to which the children participated in more everyday activities compared to before the intervention started. And then we have measures of the extent to which the parents used the everyday activity in a way that had the characteristics that we know are associated with optimal child benefits. And so you can determine different pathways of influence. So for example, one pathway of influence is from fidelity of the coaching to the fidelity of use of the intervention practices. One of the mistakes that, well, that's not a mistake, is one of the problems with a lot of the research that's done, at least in early childhood intervention. Somehow we've come to believe that what we do as practitioners or what we do as professional development specialists ought to have some type of direct effects on what happens with the children or the child outcomes. Is one of the things we've learned from all the research that we've done. Almost everything I do as a professional development specialist and everything I do as a early childhood practitioner is almost always indirectly related to outcomes of interest mediated by something else. So in this particular case, how well I do coaching is related to how well the parents use the intervention practices mediated by the parents' social validity judgments. And then the other pathway is through there. So what I do as a coach is indirectly related to how well the parents use the evidence-based characteristics of the intervention practice, mediated by both parent social validity judgments and child participation in the everyday activities. And so we have models, and I didn't put any of these in because, quite frankly, they're of interest to me but boring to most other people, is where we, for example, have been able to demonstrate that my use of family-centered practices in interactions with parents is indirectly related to child development outcomes mediated by about 10 other things. There's all kinds of pathways that it goes through. And so on this slide, what I've done is I've highlighted the relationships involving social validity, and I'll just call your attention to the fact that even though some of the other things are significantly related, as we would expect, the effects that have the largest values are the ones that involve relationships with social validity. And if there's a lesson learned from all of that, from the research we've done, is that you really need to be able to understand is people's belief systems as part of working with parents or practitioners to be sure that what you're trying to communicate is actually something that they believe is of value and importance. And so one of the things that you do as part of the use of PALS is that whatever practice you're trying to help someone else learn to use, that you take time to explain why the practice would be useful and why it would be expected to have outcomes of interest. So let me just finish up by making a couple of comments. In the work that most of us are involved in, there needs to be equal attention to both evidence-based implementation practices and evidence-based intervention practices if we're likely to increase the adoption and use of practices that we are wanting practitioners or parents to use. Beliefs about the importance and acceptability of both types of practices need to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, is that people just kind of blank face. And then the fidelity of both implementation and intervention practices need to be explicitly evaluated as part of efforts to promote the adoption of practices. Otherwise, is that you'll never know whether or not a practice is being implemented as it was supposed to be. And if you want the PowerPoint, it's on our website. Thank you.